She walked into a luxury bakery, holding a jar of coins with shaking hands. "I want the most beautiful cake for my son." They laughed at her, judged her, tried to send her away. What they didn't know was that her son hadn't opened his eyes in 3 years. This might be the last birthday she could ever give him. And she was ready to spend everything she had, just to make it feel real. And just when she was about to walk out, a U.S. Marine and his K-9 stepped in. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It brought back a truth that had been buried for years. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Snow fell in slow, steady silence over Denver, blanketing the streets in white as the late afternoon light dimmed behind thick winter clouds. Martha Collins stepped through the glass doors of the bakery with a hesitation that lived somewhere between habit and memory, as if every place like this had always required permission she had never quite been given. At 72, Martha carried the quiet wear of a life spent enduring rather than resting. She was short, barely reaching 5'2", with a slight, fragile frame that had grown thinner over the years. Her gray hair, once a soft chestnut brown, was pulled back into a loose bun, strands escaping around her temples. Her skin bore the pale, weathered tone of someone who had spent too many winters walking in the cold and too many nights under dim kitchen lights. Her coat, an old faded navy wool piece, was dusted with snow, the fabric thinning at the elbows, the buttons mismatched from repairs done over time. Clutched tightly in both hands was a large glass jar filled with coins and folded bills, pressed together so tightly they seemed to hold not just money, but months of restraint, denial, and quiet determination. Her fingers trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something she refused to name. Inside, the bakery was warm, bright, and impossibly clean. Polished glass displays stretched along the walls, showcasing cakes that looked more like art than food, multi-tiered creations adorned with delicate sugar flowers and gold accents. The air smelled of butter, vanilla, and sugar, a kind of sweetness that belonged to celebration, not survival. Martha did not look around. She had already made her choice before she ever stepped inside. She walked straight to the center display and stopped. There it was, the largest cake in the case. White frosting, smooth as untouched snow, edged with gold detailing that caught the light. It was not just beautiful, it was complete. "That one," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "I'd like that one." Behind the counter stood 2 young women. The taller one, Jessica, was in her mid-20s, tall and slender with straight blonde hair that fell neatly over her shoulders. Her posture was upright, practiced, her expression composed in the way people learn when they work in places that expect perfection. The second, Lila, shorter with dark curly hair and quick darting eyes, leaned slightly against the counter, her expression already shifting as she took in Martha's appearance, the coat, the shoes, the jar. Jessica's gaze dropped briefly to the jar, then to Martha's worn gloves, then back to her face. The smile she offered was polite, but it did not reach her eyes. "That cake," Jessica said, her tone measured, "is one of our premium selections." Martha nodded once. "I understand." There was a pause, thin, stretched, uncomfortable. "It's quite expensive," Lila added, her voice lighter but edged with something sharper. Not a warning, a test. Martha's grip tightened slightly around the jar. "I know the price," she said. She did not look down. She did not explain. She had spent too many years explaining things that never needed explanation. At that moment, the door behind her opened again, letting in a gust of cold air and a swirl of snow. A man stepped inside, tall enough that he seemed to fill the doorway for a brief second before moving forward. Staff Sergeant Caleb Hayes carried himself with the quiet control of someone who had spent most of his life in environments where hesitation had consequences. At 42, he stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, his build still solid from years of military discipline. His face was sharply defined, strong jaw, high cheekbones, a faint line of stubble that suggested he no longer followed strict regulations but hadn't entirely let go of them either. A thin scar ran just beneath his left eye, subtle but noticeable, the kind that told a story he rarely chose to share. His dark brown hair was cut short, practical, though no longer strictly military. There was a stillness to him, not cold, but controlled. The kind of man who spoke little, observed more, and acted only when necessary. At his side walked Rex, The German Shepherd moved with silent confidence, his muscular frame balanced and alert. At 5 years old, Rex was in his prime, his coat a rich blend of amber and black, thick against the cold, his ears upright, his gaze sharp and constantly scanning. Trained as a K-9 unit, Rex had spent years reading tension, detecting threats, understanding human behavior in ways most people never noticed. As soon as they entered, Rex slowed, his attention fixed, not on the displays, not on the people behind the counter, but on Martha. His posture softened slightly, not relaxed, but different. Caleb noticed immediately. Rex did not react without reason. Caleb's eyes followed the dog's line of sight and landed on the small figure standing at the counter, clutching a jar like it was something breakable. He said nothing at first, he simply watched. Back at the counter, Jessica exhaled softly. "We do have smaller options," she offered. "Something more practical." The word hung there. Martha felt it land, not on her ears, but somewhere deeper, a place that had learned to absorb things like this without reacting. "This is for my son," she said. That was all. No further explanation, no appeal for sympathy. Jessica hesitated, then straightened slightly. "I understand, ma'am, but—" Before she could finish, Caleb stepped forward. His boots made a quiet sound against the polished floor, measured, unhurried. "Why don't you count it?" he said. His voice was calm, even, but it carried. Not loud, just certain. Jessica blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Excuse me?" "The money," Caleb said, nodding toward the jar. "Count it. Right here." There was no aggression in his tone, no demand, just a simple statement that felt harder to ignore than anything louder might have been. Lila shifted, glancing between Caleb and the jar. Jessica's smile faltered, just slightly. "That's not our usual process," she replied carefully. Caleb met her gaze. "Then maybe today it is." Behind him, Rex remained still, his eyes never leaving Martha. Martha stood frozen for a moment, her heart beating harder now, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar. She wasn't used to someone stepping in, she wasn't used to not standing alone. Her fingers tightened around the jar as she slowly placed it on the counter. For a second, no one moved. The bakery, so full of light and warmth moments ago, felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if something unseen had shifted. And then, finally, Lila reached forward. She twisted the lid. The sound of glass and metal broke the silence. Coins spilled out onto the polished counter, and every eye in the room turned to watch. Snow pressed softly against the glass as the bakery fell into a tense, watchful silence. Coins spilled across the polished counter in a dull metallic cascade, breaking the stillness with a sound that felt louder than it should have been. Quarters rolled in slow circles, nickels slid into one another, and folded bills, creased, softened from repeated handling, were carefully pulled free from the jar. Martha Collins stood motionless, her thin shoulders slightly hunched, her gloved hands now empty and resting on the edge of the counter, as if she needed something solid to hold her in place. Inside, her heart beat harder than she wanted anyone to notice. She had done this before, counting, folding, saving, but never like this, never under eyes that measured her worth before the money was even finished speaking. Lila, the shorter employee with restless dark curls and sharp, uncertain eyes, began sorting the coins into neat rows, her earlier edge replaced by something quieter, more cautious. There was a subtle shift in her posture now, a hesitation in her movements, as if she had suddenly realized that what sat before her was not just spare change, but time, months of it, maybe longer. Jessica remained upright beside her, though the practiced composure she wore like a uniform had begun to fracture at the edges. Her straight blonde hair, perfectly styled, framed a face that now held less certainty than before. She watched the growing stacks of coins, her lips pressed into a thin line, her earlier confidence replaced by calculation. Caleb Hayes stood a few feet back, hands relaxed at his sides, his posture loose but deliberate. He didn't lean in, didn't hover. He had learned long ago that presence, when controlled, could be more powerful than pressure. His eyes moved between the counter and Martha, never lingering too long, but never leaving either entirely. Years in the Marines had carved that habit into him: observe, assess, wait. The faint scar beneath his left eye caught the overhead light, a quiet reminder of the kind of places he had been, and the kind of things he had learned to read without asking questions. He said nothing now, he didn't need to. Beside him, Rex sat still, his large frame grounded and alert. The German shepherd's ears remained upright, his amber eyes steady, tracking Martha rather than the money. At 5 years old, Rex had spent years trained to detect threat, tension, deception. But this was none of those things. What he sensed instead was fragility, the kind that didn't come from weakness, but from endurance stretched too far. His breathing was slow, controlled, and once, almost unconsciously, he shifted closer to Martha's side, just enough that his presence could be felt without demanding attention. Martha noticed. Not with her eyes, but with something quieter, a small awareness, like warmth in a cold room. She did not look down at the dog, but she felt the shift, and for a brief second, her grip on herself loosened just enough to breathe. The counting continued. 20, 40, 60. Lila's voice was softer now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. Each number landed carefully, as if she were afraid to rush something that deserved time. Bills were flattened, aligned, added to the total with slow precision. The small pile became larger, then larger still. Martha's thoughts moved in fragments. She remembered the first dollar she had set aside, a cold morning in January when she had stood in her kitchen, looking at Andrew, at the stillness of his chest, the steady rhythm of machines doing what his body no longer could, and made a decision she never spoke out loud. She remembered skipping meals she told herself she didn't need, walking instead of taking the bus, turning off lights earlier than necessary. Every coin had been a choice. Every bill had been a quiet promise. This has to be enough, she told herself. It has to be. Jessica exhaled slowly as the total grew. She could see where this was going now, and it unsettled her, not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant. The neat categories she relied on, the quick judgments that made her job easier, were slipping out of alignment. She had seen people like Martha before, or at least she thought she had. But those people didn't usually stand like this. They didn't usually stay. 200, Lila continued, stacking bills into a clean line. Caleb's gaze flicked briefly to Martha's hands. They trembled again, just slightly. Not fear, anticipation. He recognized that too. The kind that came when something mattered more than it should have, because there was no second chance if it failed. The room seemed to tighten as the count neared its end. Even the low hum of the refrigeration units behind the display cases felt distant now, like background noise that no longer belonged to this moment. 300. Martha closed her eyes for just a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough to steady the rush building in her chest. 320. Rex shifted again, his tail still, his body calm, but his focus unwavering. 340. Lila paused. Her fingers hovered over the last few coins. She counted them twice, slower this time, as if the outcome required confirmation beyond doubt. 347. The number settled over the room like something final. Jessica straightened, her expression carefully composed again, but this time it lacked the edge it had carried before. There was no room left for refusal, not without saying something far louder than she was willing to say out loud. Martha opened her eyes. She did not smile. She did not react outwardly at all. But something inside her shifted, something small but undeniable. Not relief, not quite. More like confirmation. "I'll take the cake," she said quietly. There was no hesitation now. Jessica nodded once. "Of course." The words came easier this time, stripped of their earlier resistance. She turned to prepare the order, her movements efficient, practiced, but different. Slower, perhaps, more deliberate. Martha began gathering the remaining coins, her fingers moving carefully, returning each piece to the jar with the same attention she had used to save it. She did not rush. This, too, mattered. Caleb stepped forward slightly, not enough to intrude, just enough to close the distance. "Cold out there," he said, his tone even. Martha glanced at him for the first time fully. Up close, she noticed the lines in his face, not from age, but from experience. The kind of lines that came from decisions made under pressure, from nights that didn't end when they should have. "I've been in worse," she replied, though her voice carried a quiet weariness that didn't quite match the words. Caleb gave a small nod, accepting the answer without challenging it. "Still," he said, "I can give you a ride." Martha hesitated, not out of fear, but out of habit. She had learned, over time, to move through the world without asking, without taking more than she believed she was owed. Offers like this didn't come often. When they did, they usually came with something attached. But there was something about the way he stood, steady, unhurried, not expecting anything in return, that made the decision feel different. She looked at the jar, now heavier again with what remained. She thought of the walk back, the snow, the time. "All right," she said finally. It was a small word, but it carried weight. Behind the counter, the cake was lifted carefully from the display, placed into a white box, tied with a thin gold ribbon. It looked just as perfect as it had under the glass. Martha reached for it, her hands steady now. For a moment, everything felt still, balanced. But Caleb's eyes lingered, not on the cake, not on the money, but on Martha herself. Because something about this wasn't finished. And as the door opened again, letting the cold wind rush back in, he realized he wasn't just walking her home. He was walking into something he didn't yet understand. Snow thickened along the windshield as the car moved slowly through Denver's fading winter light. Caleb Hayes drove with the steady, controlled focus of someone who had spent years navigating far worse conditions than snow-covered city streets. His hands rested firmly on the wheel, fingers relaxed but precise, his posture upright without tension. The heater hummed quietly, pushing warmth into the small interior, though traces of cold still clung to the edges of the glass. Beside him, Rex lay partially curled across the back seat, his large frame angled toward the front, his amber eyes shifting occasionally between Caleb and the woman seated in silence. Martha Collins held the cake carefully in her lap, both hands supporting the box, as if even the smallest movement might disturb something fragile inside it. The gold ribbon trembled slightly with the motion of the car. She hadn't spoken since they left the bakery, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she was deciding what deserved to be said out loud and what had lived too long in quiet to be easily shared. Outside, the city shifted gradually. The clean storefronts and polished sidewalks of downtown Denver gave way to narrower streets, older buildings, neighborhoods where paint chipped and fences leaned slightly inward. Snow gathered unevenly along the sidewalks here, less tended, more real. Caleb didn't ask immediately. He had learned not to force conversations that needed to arrive on their own. But the silence stretched long enough that it began to carry its own weight. "You said it was for your son," he said finally, his voice even, eyes still on the road. Martha nodded once, her gaze fixed on the cake. "Yes." There was another pause. "How old is he?" Caleb asked. 47. The answer came quickly this time, without hesitation. Numbers were easier than memories. Caleb nodded slightly. "What's his name?" Martha's fingers tightened just a little on the box. "Andrew." She said it carefully, as if the name itself required balance. Caleb repeated it once in his mind, not out loud. He had always done that, anchoring names, holding on to details. It was a habit formed long before the Marines, but refined by them. "What happened?" he asked. The question was simple, direct, not unkind. Martha inhaled slowly, the air caught for a moment before settling. She did not look at Caleb when she answered. She kept her eyes on the ribbon, tracing its line with her thumb. "He was a mechanic," she began, "worked at the same shop for over 20 years, good with his hands. Always fixing things, even when they weren't broken." A faint, almost invisible shift passed through her expression. Not quite a smile, something softer, something remembered. "He used to come home covered in grease," she continued, her voice quieter now. "Said he could tell what was wrong with an engine just by listening to it run. Said machines made more sense than people." Caleb glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. There was something in that sentence, something familiar. Martha exhaled slowly. 3 years ago, there was an accident. Her voice changed on that word, not louder, not weaker, just different. "He was under a lift, something failed, they said it wasn't supposed to happen like that." She paused, her hand going still against the box. "They told me his head hit the concrete." The car moved forward, tires crunching softly over snow. Caleb said nothing. He didn't interrupt. He didn't fill the silence. He let it stay where it needed to be. "He was alive when they took him to the hospital," Martha said. "That's what they told me. They said that like it was something good." Her grip tightened again. "He never woke up." The words settled between them, final, uncomplicated. Rex shifted slightly in the back seat, his ears tilting forward at the change in tone. He did not move closer this time, but his attention sharpened, his breathing slow and steady. They said his brain. Martha hesitated, searching for the word she had heard too many times and never accepted. They said it was severe, that he might respond someday, or not. Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. He had seen that kind of uncertainty before, not in hospitals, but in other places, with different words, carrying the same weight. So now, he said carefully. He's there, Martha answered. He breathes, his heart beats, but he doesn't. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Caleb nodded once, slowly. He understood enough. Martha looked down at the cake again. He always liked chocolate, she said, but this one, I thought maybe… Her voice faded. Caleb glanced at the box, white frosting, gold trim, perfect edges. It's a good cake, he said quietly. Martha gave a small nod, though her eyes didn't lift. It should be, she said. It took me long enough. That caught his attention. How long? He asked. She hesitated, then answered. Since January. Caleb did the math without thinking. Months, small amounts, consistent effort. He looked at her hands again, the slight tremor, the careful control. You've been saving for that long? Yes. For this? For him. The simplicity of the answer left no room for anything else. The car turned onto a narrower street, the snow deeper here, untouched in places. Houses sat close together, their lights dim behind frosted windows. South Denver? Caleb asked. Martha nodded. I've lived here a long time. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, just a fraction, a flicker of recognition that hadn't fully formed yet. What street? He asked. Martha told him. Caleb didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed on the road, but something in his focus changed. Not distraction, something else. Something pulling at memory. That area, he said slowly, used to be different. It still is, Martha replied quietly. Caleb almost smiled at that. Almost. They drove the rest of the way in silence, not empty this time, but full. When they pulled up in front of a small aging house with peeling paint and a narrow front step, Caleb turned off the engine. The sudden quiet felt louder than the drive. I can carry that, he said, nodding toward the cake. Martha hesitated, then shook her head gently. No, I've got it. It wasn't stubbornness, it was something else, something he didn't challenge. He stepped out anyway, moving around the car to open her door. Rex followed immediately, landing lightly in the snow, his breath visible in the cold air. Martha stepped out slowly, the cold hitting her again, but she didn't seem to notice it the same way. Not now. She walked toward the door, each step measured. Caleb followed a few paces behind, and as he looked at the house, at the worn steps, the narrow frame, the familiar spacing between windows, something inside him tightened. Not recognition, not yet, but close, very close. The porch creaked under their weight as the cold settled deeper into the quiet street. Martha Collins pushed the door open slowly, one hand still steadying the cake box against her chest, the other turning the worn brass handle with care born from routine. The hinges gave a soft, tired sound as the door moved inward, revealing a narrow living space warmed by a faint yellow light that seemed to struggle against the windows. The air inside carried a mix of antiseptic, old wood, and something softer, like detergent that had long since faded but never fully left. Caleb stepped in behind her, his boots leaving shallow prints on the thin mat by the entrance before he stopped instinctively, scanning the room without appearing to do so. It was a habit that never left him. Doorways, corners, exits, the positioning of objects. But this place didn't feel like something to assess. It felt like something to understand. Rex entered last, his movement quiet, deliberate, his body lowering slightly as if adjusting to the shift in atmosphere. His ears flicked once, then settled, his attention immediately drawn forward into the house, not searching for threat, but something else, something still. Martha moved slowly toward the back of the room. He's in here, she said, her voice low, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. Caleb followed, his steps measured, his gaze shifting past the worn couch, the small table with uneven legs, the stack of folded blankets placed neatly in the corner. Every object seemed used, not displayed. Lived in, endured. Then he saw him. Andrew Collins lay on a narrow hospital-style bed set against the far wall, partially elevated, surrounded by quiet machines that blinked and hummed with steady, mechanical consistency. Tubes ran along the side of the bed, one connected to a monitor that traced a slow, rhythmic line across a dim screen. His body was thinner than Caleb expected, his frame reduced by time and stillness, his arms resting at his sides with a kind of unnatural calm. His dark hair had grown uneven, longer than it should have been, and his face, though not old, carried a stillness that did not belong to sleep. Caleb stopped just inside the doorway. Something in his chest tightened, not sharply, not suddenly, but with a slow, undeniable weight. He had seen men injured before. He had seen stillness like this, though rarely in places like this, rarely wrapped in something so quiet, so personal. Martha set the cake carefully on the small table beside the bed. Her movements became more precise now, more deliberate, as though she were entering a space that required respect beyond habit. "This is Andrew," she said, her voice softer than before. Caleb nodded once, though his eyes didn't leave the man on the bed. Rex stepped forward slowly, his nose lifting slightly as he took in the scent of the room, medical, stale, human, unmoving. He paused near the foot of the bed, his posture lowering further, his head tilting just slightly as he observed. There was no tension in him, no alertness of threat, only a quiet recognition of something beyond his usual training. Martha reached out and adjusted the blanket near Andrew's shoulder, her fingers gentle, practiced. "His birthday is today," she said. "I try to keep things the same." Caleb glanced briefly at the cake, then back at Andrew. "How long has it been?" he asked. 3 years, Martha replied. "Next month." 3 years. Caleb let the number settle. That wasn't an event, that was a life. He stepped closer, just enough to see Andrew more clearly, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the mechanical rhythm assisting what his body no longer commanded on its own. Then something shifted. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. Caleb's eyes moved slowly around the room, past the bed, past the machines, to the wall just beside the doorway. There, hanging slightly uneven, was a small framed photograph. The glass had a faint crack in one corner, barely noticeable unless you were looking directly at it. A younger Martha stood in that photo, her hair darker, her posture stronger, her expression almost unrecognizable in its lightness. Beside her stood a boy, thin, sharp-featured, no more than 10 years old. He wasn't smiling, not exactly, but there was something open in his face, something unguarded. Caleb's breath caught, just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to change everything. He stepped closer to the photo without realizing he was moving. "That picture," he said quietly. "Where was that taken?" Martha followed his gaze. "Old place," she said. "South Denver, before I moved here." The words landed differently this time. South Denver. Caleb's mind shifted, something aligning with something else. The street names, the spacing of houses, the narrow sidewalks, the sound of doors closing at night. He turned back to her slowly. "What street?" She told him. And that was it. The memory didn't return all at once. It came in fragments, pieces. A door, a knock, the smell of food carried through thin walls, his mother's voice, tired, low, trying to sound steady when it wasn't. And a woman, not saying much, not staying long, just there. "You used to knock," Caleb said, his voice quieter now. "At the door. Late. Not too late. Just enough." Martha frowned slightly, searching his face now, really looking at him for the first time. "You never came inside," he continued. "You just handed over a plate and left." The room seemed to narrow around the words. Martha's hand stilled where it rested on the edge of the bed. "I was—" Caleb hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what he was about to confirm. "I was the kid in the apartment next to yours. My mom worked nights. Sometimes we didn't have—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Martha's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in recognition of something she hadn't expected to return. "I didn't know your name," Caleb said. "Not back then." She shook her head slowly. "I didn't know yours either." Silence filled the space again, but this time it wasn't empty, it was full. Rex shifted, stepping closer to Martha now, his body settling beside her leg, as if grounding the moment without interrupting it. Martha looked down at her hands, at the same hands that had knocked on that door years ago. The same hands that had carried plates, that had fixed blankets, that now rested beside her son's unmoving form. "I just made extra," she said quietly. "That's all." Caleb almost let out a breath that sounded like something else, something heavier. "That wasn't just," he said. Martha didn't respond. She didn't argue. She simply turned back toward Andrew, adjusting the blanket again, her movements returning to their quiet rhythm. But something had changed. Caleb stood there, looking at her, not as a stranger anymore, not even as someone he had helped in a store, but as someone who had existed in his life long before he understood what it meant. He had spent years building himself into something stronger, something capable, something that didn't need to rely on anyone. And now, standing in that small room, he realized he hadn't built it alone. Snow settled softly against the window as the small room filled with a quiet, fragile light. Martha Collins stood beside the narrow bed, her hands steady in a way they had not been earlier that day. The cake rested on the small table near Andrew, its white frosting glowing faintly under the dim yellow lamp, the gold trim catching just enough light to feel almost out of place in a room that had never known luxury. The candles, simple, thin, uneven, stood in a careful line across the top, each one placed with intention, each one marking a year that had passed, whether her son had lived it or not. She struck the match slowly. The flame flickered, small at first, then steady. One by one, she lit each candle, her fingers moving with practiced care. Caleb Hayes stood a few feet back, his broad frame partially shadowed by the doorway, his posture still, almost reverent. Rex lay near the foot of the bed, his body relaxed but alert, his eyes fixed on Martha, watching not with curiosity, but with a quiet understanding shaped by years beside a man who had learned to carry weight without speaking it. Martha finished lighting the last candle and paused. For a moment, she simply looked at them, her expression unreadable, as if she were trying to align the present with something that no longer existed. 47, she said softly. Her voice didn't break, it didn't tremble, it simply settled. She leaned slightly closer to the bed. "Happy birthday, Andrew." Caleb shifted his weight, not enough to draw attention, but enough to ground himself in the moment. He had stood in rooms like this before, different circumstances, different reasons, but always the same quiet tension between what was and what could not be changed. Martha closed her eyes for just a second, then she took a breath, and she blew out the candles. The flames vanished all at once, leaving behind thin trails of smoke that curled upward and disappeared into the still air. For a moment, the room seemed darker than before, as if something had been taken with the light instead of simply extinguished. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears tilting forward, sensing the shift. Caleb's gaze moved from the fading smoke to Martha's face. She did not cry. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she had learned, over time, how to carry grief in a way that did not require witnesses. She reached out and touched Andrew's hand, her fingers resting lightly against his skin. "You always liked chocolate better," she murmured, almost to herself. "But this one's nicer." The faintest trace of something passed across her face, something that might have been a smile once. Caleb stepped forward slowly, his voice low. "It looks good." Martha nodded without looking at him. "It should be." There was no pride in her voice, only completion. The moment passed, not with resolution, but with acceptance. In the days that followed, Caleb returned. At first, it was simple. He came back the next morning, then the day after that. He brought groceries once, then tools. He fixed a loose hinge on the front door, replaced a flickering bulb in the hallway, adjusted the thermostat that never seemed to hold its setting. He did not ask permission for everything, but he did not assume it either. He moved through the space with care, as if aware that every object, every corner, had already endured enough. Rex followed him each time, settling quickly into a quiet routine. He would lie near Andrew's bed for long stretches, unmoving except for the occasional lift of his head when Martha passed by. Other times, he stayed close to her, resting against her leg, a steady presence that required nothing but offered something she hadn't realized she needed. Caleb also began taking Martha with him to the hospital. Not for her, but for Andrew. He sat beside her in waiting rooms, spoke with doctors, asked questions she hadn't known how to ask anymore. One of them, Dr. Elaine Foster, was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and short, silver-streaked hair that framed a face marked by years of difficult conversations. She carried herself with quiet authority, her voice calm but direct, the kind of doctor who did not soften reality, but did not deliver it without care either. "The damage is extensive," she explained during one visit, her tone measured. "We can maintain his condition, support him, but recovery," she paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect, "is unlikely." Martha listened without interrupting. Caleb watched her more than he watched the doctor. He could see the way her shoulders remained still, the way her hands folded together in her lap, not tight, not tense, just contained. "What can we do?" Caleb asked. Dr. Foster met his gaze. "We continue," she said. "We keep him comfortable. We give him time." Time. Caleb nodded once. He understood what she meant. And so they did. Days became weeks. The routine held. Caleb came back every morning, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but always returning. He made calls, followed leads, asked questions that often led nowhere. He looked into specialists, treatments, possibilities that existed more in theory than in practice. Not because he believed they would change the outcome, but because not trying wasn't something he knew how to accept. Martha watched it all with quiet attention. She never stopped him. She never encouraged him either. She simply allowed it. For the first time in years, she was not the only one standing in that space between hope and reality. Then one morning, everything shifted. It was subtle at first. The rhythm of the machine changed. The steady, mechanical consistency faltered just slightly. Caleb noticed it before Martha did. Years of listening for what didn't belong had trained him for that. "Martha," he said quietly. She looked up immediately. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew something was. The room grew still in a different way this time. Not quiet, but waiting. Caleb stepped closer to the bed. The monitor flickered, the line uneven now, breaking the pattern it had held for years. Martha moved to Andrew's side, her hand finding his without hesitation. "It's all right," she whispered. "It's all right." Her voice was steady, softer than ever, but certain. The machine gave one last sound, and then it stopped. There was no suddenness, no violence, just an end. Martha stood there for a long moment, her hand still resting against his, as if waiting for something that had already passed. Caleb didn't move. Rex remained still, his head lowered slightly, as though recognizing something beyond command. After a while, Martha inhaled slowly. "He's not in pain anymore," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded once. No. The days after the funeral passed quietly. The house felt different now, not emptier, but altered. The machines were gone. The space around the bed remained, but it no longer held the same tension. Martha moved through it with the same steady rhythm, though there was a stillness in her now that had not been there before. Caleb kept coming back, not every hour, not every moment, but often enough that the silence did not settle too deeply. He repaired what needed fixing, brought food when it was needed, stayed when there was nothing to do but sit. Rex found his place beside Martha's chair, resting his head gently against her knee, as if anchoring her to something that remained. One evening, as the light faded and the snow began again, Martha looked at Caleb for a long moment. "You don't have to keep coming," she said. Caleb met her gaze, his expression calm, unchanged. "I know," he replied. There was no explanation, no justification. He didn't need one. Because this was no longer about what he owed. It was about what he chose. Sometimes, miracles don't come as sudden healings or second chances. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, in the form of people who walk into your life at the exact moment you need them most. God doesn't always change the outcome we pray for, but He often sends someone to walk beside us through it, to carry a piece of the weight when we no longer can. In a world that can feel cold and distant, kindness is never wasted. The smallest act, like a knock on a door or a hand reaching out, can echo years later in ways we could never imagine. In our everyday lives, we may not realize it, but we are constantly being given chances to be that miracle for someone else. A moment of compassion, a simple act of care. It might be the light that carries someone through their darkest day. And maybe, just maybe, the good we give without expecting anything in return will find its way back to us exactly when we need it most. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. Leave a comment and tell us, have you ever experienced a moment like this? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of compassion and faith. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace into your life and your home.